Have you ever stopped to think about why people who grew up in the 1970s have a mindset so different from today's generations? Why they seem more resilient, more thoughtful, carrying a kind of wisdom that transcends time? The answer goes deeper than nostalgia. There's a powerful philosophical connection between that era and the ancient teachings of Socrates and Stoicism. And I promise you, the final revelation in this video will completely change the way you see your own existence. If you want to understand how an entire generation was shaped by philosophical principles without even knowing it, and how that can transform your life today, subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss content that could revolutionize your way of thinking. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just history, it's an emotional survival manual for modern times. Let's begin with a question Socrates himself would ask. Do you truly know yourself? Children in the 1970s grew up in a world where self-knowledge wasn't optional. It was necessary. There was no internet, no social media, no instant validation through likes and comments. What did they have? Time. Plenty of time to think, reflect, and look inward. Socrates said that a life without reflection isn't worth living. And those kids, without even realizing it, lived that principle every single day. Picture an ordinary afternoon in the 1970s. A kid comes home from school. No hundreds of TV channels, no advanced video games, no smartphone to distract them. What do? They play outside, talk with real friends face to face, invent games using imagination, and when they're alone, they simply think. That solitude wasn't seen as something negative, but as a sacred space for personal growth. And here lies the first big secret that generation learned early on, that happiness doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but the way we interpret them. Kids in the 1970s grew up during times of social change, economic uncertainty, and political instability in many countries. But they learned something essential. You can't control the external world, only your reactions. When a toy broke, buying a new one the next day wasn't an option. You needed creativity, you needed acceptance, you needed to move on. That is pure Stoicism in practice. Socrates spent his days in the squares of Athens, talking to people, questioning, provoking reflection. He believed dialogue was the most powerful tool for reaching truth and self-knowledge. In the 1970s, kids did exactly that. They talked for hours, debated, told stories, learned from each other. There was no pressure to respond instantly, no superficial digital interactions. Every conversation was a deep dive into the human soul, and that shaped extraordinary minds. But pay close attention, because here's where things get fascinating. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, wrote in Meditations that we must accept everything that happens as natural and necessary. He spoke about living in the present, not clinging to the past or worrying excessively about the future. Kids in the 1970s lived this intensely. They couldn't pause a TV show to watch later. They couldn't save messages for later replies. Everything happened now. And that presence, that ability to be fully immersed in the moment, is something modern psychology considers essential for mental health. Do you see the pattern? These people weren't formally taught Stoic philosophy or Socratic methods, but they lived those principles organically. And here's a truth few recognize. Adversity doesn't destroy character, it reveals and strengthens it. Seneca said that difficulties are opportunities to demonstrate virtue. The 1970s weren't easy. Limited technology, economic challenges, social uncertainty. But those limitations forced an entire generation to develop resilience, creativity, and emotional depth. Think about it. When you don't have instant access to everything, you learn to appreciate. When you can't replace things easily, you learn to take care of them. When you aren't constantly distracted, you learn to live with yourself. These aren't just behaviors. They're philosophies of life that Socrates and the Stoics taught more than 2,000 years ago, and the generation of the 1970s embedded these philosophies into their collective psyche in a way we may never see again. Now tell me, are you starting to understand why these people have such striking inner strength? But wait, because what comes next will connect everything in a way you never imagined. Let's dive even deeper into this fascinating connection. And before we continue, if you're enjoying this content and recognizing its value, click the like button right now. It helps the channel reach more people searching for this kind of transformative knowledge. Your support is essential. Socrates had a revolutionary teaching method. He didn't give ready-made answers. He asked questions that forced people to think for themselves, to challenge their beliefs, to uncover truths hidden within. This method, called maieutic, was like midwifery for ideas. And here's the amazing part. Kids in the 1970s lived this without a single philosophy book in hand. How so? Think about it. When you had just a few TV channels and no Google to answer every question within seconds, what did you do when you were curious about something? You talked to your parents, your grandparents, your teachers, your friends, and these conversations weren't shallow. They sparked debates, reflections, new questions. A simple curiosity about how a clock worked could turn into a philosophical discussion about time, life, and existence. Kids in the 1970s developed critical thinking naturally because they had no alternative. Marcus Aurelius wrote something profound. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. He meant inner control, the ability to shape your own mind. And here's something that might surprise you. The generation of the 1970s had a huge psychological advantage. They weren't bombarded by thousands of conflicting pieces of information every day. No algorithms manipulating emotions. No constant comparisons with perfect lives online. That meant they could cultivate their own thoughts with clarity and authenticity. Psychologist Carl Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, free from external expectations. In the 1970s, this happened naturally. A child didn't have to fit into dozens of online groups or perform for an invisible audience. They could simply be. And when you remove constant approval pressure, something magical happens. You discover your true essence. The Stoics had a concept called amor fati, love of fate. It means embracing everything that happens, good or bad, as a necessary part of your journey. Seneca said life is like a play. It doesn't matter if it's long or short, but whether it's well performed. People who grew up in the 1970s learned this by living it. They couldn't edit their lives, create false versions of themselves, or delete embarrassing moments. Everything was real, raw, authentic. And that created a generation with rare emotional integrity. Think of the games back then. Pick-up basketball, hide-and-seek, jump rope, flying kites. All these activities had something in common: genuine interaction, physical effort, facing wins and losses. When you lost a game, you couldn't just close an app and restart. You had to deal with frustration, learn from it, try again the next day. That's exactly what Epictetus taught when he said we must distinguish between what is under our control and what isn't. You don't control the outcome. You control your effort and attitude. Solitude in the 1970s had a different meaning. It wasn't the unhealthy loneliness of modern disconnection, but the productive solitude of reflection. Socrates used to say he needed time alone to hear his daimon, his inner voice, his conscience. Kids back then had that time naturally. After school, while waiting for dinner on quiet Sunday afternoons, they had moments of silence and even boredom that were incredibly productive for psychological development. Contemporary neuroscientist Andrew Huberman talks about the importance of boredom for creativity and mental health. He explains that it's during moments of doing nothing that the brain processes information, consolidates memories, and generates insights. In the 1970s, boredom was common and far from harmful. It was one of the greatest gifts that generation received. Because boredom breeds imagination, and imagination breeds innovation. But there's more. The Stoics taught memento mori. Remember that you will die. It sounds gloomy, but it's not. It's a powerful reminder to live fully, appreciate every moment, and avoid wasting time on trivial things. In the 1970s, death wasn't such a taboo. Families were larger, multi-generational. Kids spent time with grandparents and great-grandparents, witnessing the natural cycle of life up close. That created a sense of mortality that paradoxically made life more precious. Do you see how every element of that era worked together to shape philosophically mature minds? It wasn't accidental. It was the perfect combination of technological limitations, social structure, and basic human needs that naturally encouraged the development of Stoic qualities. And the most fascinating part is still to come. Now we're about to dig into something that can shake you to your core. Socrates was sentenced to death for asking questions. Yes, you heard that right. He was considered dangerous simply because he made people think, question, challenge the status quo. And why does this matter when we try to understand the psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s? Because they were raised in a time when questioning was still possible, when divergent thinking wasn't instantly shut down, cancelled, or muted. Think about the historical context. The 1970s were marked by counterculture movements, deep skepticism toward authority, protests against war, and debates about social values. Kids grew up watching their parents and older siblings question everything. They learned that thinking for themselves wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. That is pure Socratic thinking. Don't accept anything without examining it. Don't follow blindly. Always ask why. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, lesser known but profoundly wise, taught that philosophy wasn't just theory, it was daily practice. He said there was no point in knowing what is right if you don't live according to that knowledge. And here lies the beauty of the 70s generation. They didn't learn Stoicism from books, but from lived experience. Every challenge they faced was a practical lesson in virtue. Let's talk about personal responsibility. In the 1970s, when you made a mistake, there was no delete button, no edit feature, no way to pretend it didn't happen. If you fought with a friend, you had to show up in person, apologize face to face, feel the discomfort of vulnerability. If you broke something, you owned up to it. There were no screens to hide behind. That created a generation with a sense of integrity and accountability the Stoics would have admired. Epictetus, who started life as a slave, taught that true freedom comes from within, not from external circumstances. He said you could be physically chained but mentally free, or physically free yet enslaved by your own desires and fears. Kids in the 1970s had fewer material freedoms than kids today, but they developed greater psychological freedom. They learned to be content with less, to find joy in the simple, to live without needing constant external stimulation to feel alive. Modern psychologists are rediscovering something the 1970s lived naturally: delayed gratification. The famous marshmallow experiment showed that children who could wait for a bigger reward tended to be more successful in life. In the 70s, life itself was an exercise in waiting. Want a toy? You waited until your birthday or Christmas. Want to watch your favorite show? You waited for the right day and time. That waiting wasn't torture, it was training. Training in self-control, patience, and perseverance, the core Stoic virtues. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should be like a rock against which the waves crash, but which remains unshaken. That is the perfect image of Stoic resilience. And those who grew up in the 1970s embody that quality. They faced economic crises, massive social changes, uncertainties of every kind, yet developed the steadiness of that rock. Not because they were stronger by nature, but because life trained them to be. Let's talk about community. Socrates didn't teach in formal schools. He taught in public squares, in spontaneous conversations, in everyday life. In the 1970s, life happened in the neighborhood. Kids played together outside. Families ate dinner together every night. Neighbors knew each other and helped each other. There was a sense of belonging, of interdependence, that nourished the soul in ways no social network has ever replicated. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote about the human search for meaning. He observed that those who survived the camps weren't always the physically strongest, but those who had a purpose, a reason to live. Children of the 1970s grew up in a culture that still valued larger purposes. Work was a calling, not just a paycheck. Family was sacred. Friendship was a long-term commitment. These anchors of meaning created deep psychological stability. Seneca said, "It's not because things are difficult that we don't dare. It's because we don't dare that they're difficult." In the 1970s, kids were encouraged to dare. Climb trees, explore the neighborhood, invent games, solve their own problems. Yes, there were risks, but those calculated risks built confidence and competence. Today, we call that self-efficacy, the belief in one's ability to handle challenges. But there's something deeper at play. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, both external nature and human nature. In the 1970s, kids spent far more time outside. They planted things, they harvested things, they watched the seasons change. They developed an intuitive sense of timing, of natural rhythms, of patience. That organic wisdom is almost gone in the digital age. But hold on, because what comes next reveals the core of everything, the piece that ties all of this together in a surprising way. Here's the truth no one tells you. The psychology of the 1970s generation wasn't shaped by what they had, but by what they lacked. And that's not a contradiction. It's the essence of Stoic thought. Epictetus taught that wealth isn't having great possessions, but having few needs. This generation grew up with less, but paradoxically developed more. More character, more depth, more ability to find joy in the simple. From a modern psychological perspective, neuroplasticity shows that the brain molds itself through lived experience. In the 1970s, kids' brains were constantly forming deep neural pathways. When you have to invent a game from scratch, your brain builds creativity. When you resolve conflicts face-to-face, you develop real emotional intelligence. When you endure frustration without instant escape, you build genuine resilience. Socrates had a powerful phrase, "I know that I know nothing." That intellectual humility, that awareness of one's limits, is the mark of true wisdom. And here's the fascinating part. In the 70s, people lived with more awareness of their limits. There wasn't the illusion of expertise the internet creates today, where reading one article makes someone feel like a specialist. There was respect for real knowledge, for real experts, for years of experience. This fostered a humility that opened space for genuine learning. The Stoics practiced something called premeditatio malorum, negative visualization. It wasn't pessimism, but mental preparation. Marcus Aurelius began each day imagining potential difficulties, not to depress himself, but to avoid being surprised by them. Kids in the 1970s lived a practical version of this. They knew not everything would work out. There would be disappointments. Life had ups and downs. And because they learned this early, they developed impressive emotional stability. Let me tell you something that will change your perspective. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi discovered the concept of flow, that state of complete immersion where time disappears. Flow happens when challenge and skill are perfectly balanced. Too easy, boredom. Too hard, anxiety. But at the sweet spot, you enter flow. In the 1970s, children's activities naturally created these conditions, building go-karts, organizing pickup games, creating stories with friends. These required effort, but were achievable, creating constant experiences of flow. Seneca wrote about the importance of true friendship, saying that a loyal friend is life's greatest treasure. In the 70s, friendships were built through time and shared experience. You didn't have hundreds of virtual friends. You had 5 or 10 real ones you spent hours with. You knew their families, shared secrets, lived important moments together. These deep connections became the foundation of lifelong mental health. Here's something crucial most people overlook. Identity in the 1970s was built from the inside out, not from the outside in. Today, many people build identities based on external feedback, social media metrics, constant comparison. In the 70s, you discovered who you were through direct experience, trial and error, personal reflection, no filters, no editing. You confronted your true nature, your real fears, your real strengths. This is what Socrates meant by know thyself. Neuroscientist Daniel Kahneman talks about two systems of thought, one fast and intuitive, the other slow and deliberate. Modern life favors the fast system. Instant responses, impulsive decisions. The slower pace of the 1970s allowed and required deliberate thought. You had time to think before acting, to weigh consequences, to make conscious choices. That developed a level of reasoning increasingly rare today. The Stoics spoke of aperire oculos, opening your eyes, not just physically but spiritually and intellectually, seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. In the 1970s, there were fewer buffers between you and reality. Life was more raw, more direct. Kids saw their parents working hard, saw bills being paid with difficulty, saw that everything had cost and value. That connection with concrete reality built early maturity. And here's something deeply important about failure. In the 1970s, failure was normal, expected, part of learning. You failed, you stood back up, you tried again. There was no permanent record of every mistake, no massive public judgment. Failure was private, instructive, even encouraged. The Stoics saw failure as a teacher. Seneca said that sometimes even living is an act of courage. This acceptance of failure as part of the journey created a boldness that allowed people to try new things without today's paralyzing fear. But pay attention, because what I'm about to reveal next ties all of these threads together in a way you never expected. We've arrived at the point where everything connects in an extraordinary way. There's a Stoic concept called sympatheia, which means the interconnection of all things. Marcus Aurelius wrote about how everything in the universe is linked, how every action sends out ripples that affect the whole. And here is the powerful revelation. People who grew up in the 1970s experienced this interconnection in a tangible, everyday way that shaped their psychology in deep and lasting ways. Think about it. When you lived in a small town or in a close-knit neighborhood, every action had visible consequences. If you treated someone badly, you couldn't just block them and forget about it. You'd run into them on the street, at school, in real life. That created an acute awareness that your actions mattered, that you were part of a larger social fabric. It wasn't just philosophical theory, it was lived reality. Every choice carried weight, every word had impact. Socrates said that the most precious thing is virtue. Not wealth, not fame, not pleasure, but virtue. And virtue for him meant excellence of character, integrity, doing the right thing even when it's hard. In the 1970s, kids grew up with a clearer moral code. There were expectations for behavior, respect, responsibility, and most importantly, there were real consequences when those expectations weren't met. That wasn't oppression, it was structure. And modern psychology shows that children need structure to develop self-control and character. The psychologist Jean Piaget studied cognitive development and found that children learn through direct interaction with their environment. In the 1970s, that interaction was rich and varied. A kid learned physics by playing outside, math by helping with the grocery shopping, biology by taking care of plants or pets, chemistry by cooking with their parents. Learning was integrated into life, not separated into educational apps. This created a deeper, more connected understanding of the world. Epictetus had a powerful exercise. Begin each day by being grateful for everything you have, even the simplest things. He called this recognizing your blessings. In the 1970s, people had less, so they valued what they had more. A child who got a single toy for Christmas treated it like a treasure. A weekend outing was a special event, not a boring obligation. A long-distance phone call from a friend was a moment of genuine joy. This ability to find happiness in simplicity, to appreciate what you have, is at the heart of Stoic gratitude. Now pay attention to this crucial point. The Stoics spoke of ataraxia, a state of unshakable inner tranquility, not the absence of emotion, but deep emotional balance. And how is that achieved? Through years of practice dealing with adversity, accepting what can't be changed, and focusing only on what's within your control. People in the 1970s had decades of this training. Every difficulty they overcame became a brick in the foundation of their inner fortress. Let me ask you a Socratic question. What makes a life meaningful? The number of likes you get, how many followers you have? Or is it the depth of your relationships, the integrity of your choices, the positive impact you have on those around you? In the 1970s, the answer was obvious. Meaning came from real contribution, genuine connection, tangible legacy. A father teaching his kid to ride a bike, a mother preparing meals with care, a teacher spending extra time with a struggling student. These moments created real meaning. The philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote about being in the world, the importance of being present and engaged in your own existence. In the 1970s, people were forced to be present. There were no endless screens to escape into, no virtual worlds to hide inside. You had to deal with your life, your emotions, the people around you. And although that could be uncomfortable sometimes, it was exactly this discomfort that fueled real psychological growth. Seneca wrote about the shortness of life and how most people waste it on things that don't matter. He said, "We don't have a short life, we just squander much of it." In the 1970s, there was a greater awareness of time. Without the illusion of digital immortality, without the option to pause and resume life at will, people understood that every moment was unique and unrecoverable. That created a healthy urgency, a desire to live fully, not procrastinate life. And here's something that will make you reflect deeply. The Stoics practiced what they called the visualization of death, not to be morbid, but to remind themselves to live with intensity and purpose. Marcus Aurelius would ask himself each morning, "If this were my last day, how would I live it?" In the 1970s, with fewer digital distractions, people had more mental space for these existential reflections. And these reflections were not depressing. They made life richer and more meaningful. Psychologist Abraham Maslow developed the famous hierarchy of needs and described self-actualization, the highest level of human development. He found that self-actualized people share several traits. They accept themselves and others. They're spontaneous and genuine. They focus on problems outside themselves. They have a sense of purpose. Many people in the 1970s naturally developed these traits because their environment fostered them. Now get ready, because this final part brings the synthesis of it all, the most powerful lesson you can apply to your life today. And here we reach the final revelation, the one I promised from the beginning. The deepest truth about the psychology of those who grew up in the 1970s is not just historical, it's transformative for you right now. Because everything they lived, all the Stoic and Socratic principles they embodied without knowing it, you can deliberately choose to apply to your life today. Socrates was sentenced to death, but before drinking the hemlock, he told his disciples something extraordinary. Don't fear death. Fear a life not examined. He chose to die with integrity instead of living while betraying his principles. And here's the bridge between that era and now. You have a choice. The 1970s generation didn't choose to be born into a world without the internet, without smartphones, without social media. But you can choose to embrace the values that world imposed on them. Let me be direct with you. The reason people from the 1970s seem to have such powerful inner strength isn't because they were better or more special. It's because they were trained by life, by circumstances, by limitations. And here's the transformative news. you can train yourself too. Marcus Aurelius wasn't naturally stoic. He practiced every day. His meditations were literally notes to himself, constant reminders of the principles he wanted to live by. What does that mean for you today? It means you can deliberately create spaces of silence in your life. You can choose to spend an hour a day without screens. You can practice daily gratitude by listing simple things you appreciate. You can cultivate deep friendships instead of superficial connections. You can embrace discomfort instead of always seeking the easy path. You can question your own beliefs like Socrates taught. You can practice the Stoic exercise of negative visualization to build resilience. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, whom I mentioned earlier, survived the unimaginable horrors of concentration camps and discovered something profound. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose our response. People in the 1970s learned this intuitively because they had more space between question and answer, emotion and reaction, want and satisfaction. You can recreate that space. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of the greatest philosophers, taught that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. Children in the 1970s lived this, and you can live it too. When something bad happens, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what's within my control here? And focus only on that. This simple practice can transform your entire experience of life. Now, the most powerful revelation of all. Do you realize what truly set that generation apart? It wasn't what they had or didn't have. It was the quality of attention they could give to things. Deep, unfragmented attention. When they talked, they really talked. When they played, they really played. When they studied, they really studied. There was no constant multitasking, no notifications cutting every moment in half, and deep attention is the secret ingredient for everything that matters in life. Meaningful relationships, quality work, real learning, genuine personal growth. Seneca said something that echoes across millennia. We are not preparing to live, we are already living. Stop postponing real life. Stop waiting for perfect conditions. People in the 1970s didn't have perfect conditions, yet they lived fully anyway. You have infinitely more resources than they did, but the question is, are you truly living or just existing? Here's your challenge. If you've had the courage to stay with me this far, choose one Stoic principle and practice it for 30 days. It can be daily gratitude, 1 hour each day without screens, one deep conversation a week, accepting a discomfort instead of avoiding it. Just one principle, practiced consistently. Watch how your psychology begins to change. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, I'm going to practice Stoicism. I want to see how many of you are truly committed to transformation, and tell us which principle you'll choose. Let's build a community of people who choose to live with more depth, more purpose, more virtue. The 1970s generation teaches us that limitations aren't prisons, they're laboratories. That discomfort isn't an enemy, it's a teacher. That simplicity isn't poverty, it's richness. That real connections are worth more than 1,000 virtual ones. That a life examined, as Socrates preached, is infinitely more valuable than a comfortable but empty one. And here is the final truth. You don't need to return to the 1970s to have the wisdom of that generation. You only need to choose to live by the same principles they lived by unintentionally. Choose presence over distraction, depth over superficiality, virtue over convenience, growth over comfort. Marcus Aurelius ended his meditations with a simple but profound thought. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That was the strength of the 1970s generation, and it can be your strength too. If this video touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on your own life, do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to this channel. We're going to keep exploring timeless wisdom applied to the modern world. Second, leave a like and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. And third, watch the two videos appearing on your screen right now. One dives deeper into practical Stoicism, and the other shows how to apply Socratic wisdom to tough decisions in modern life. Remember, you don't choose the circumstances, but you choose who you become through them. That was the lesson of the 1970s generation, and it can be the lesson that transforms your life starting today. Philosophy isn't trapped in ancient books. It's in the daily choices you make. Choose wisely, choose deeply, choose virtue, and you'll discover that the strength you admire in that generation has always been inside you, waiting to be awakened. See you in the next video, and remember, an unexamined life isn't worth living. Examine yours, transform yours, live yours.